There is an absurd range of limitations we put on women when we tell them what to do in order to avoid being victims of violence such as abuse and rape. We tell them, don't dress up and be sexy. Don't walk alone after 6 p.m. Stay on the phone with someone you trust so you don't get kidnapped. Don't drink your cocktail if you've stayed away from it for too long. It's ridiculous. And that's why this episode is directed with the aim not of telling women what to do, because as a woman I care about recently responded when I told her to stay safe, it's not up to women whether they remain safe or not. It's up to men. Our approach to gender-based violence has to be directed towards raising young men who understand the consequences of holding toxic views about women's bodies and how those views spill over into violent behavior such as rape and other forms of gender-based violence. This is a controversial point within certain circles, but hear me out. In the conversations around toxic masculinity, there is often a desire to manufacture out of men what they are simply not. And that is pliant and acquiescent beings who will one day buy into the narrative that everything about their existence is poisonous and toxic. And although this isn't stated that bluntly, it is worth noting that from a communication standpoint, that's what men who avoid conversations around masculinity claim to be hearing. And the natural response is then to gravitate towards voices that define masculinity in a way that resonates, even if those voices are themselves, in truth, actually toxic. In discussing how it is that we speak to, especially young men, about manhood and masculinity that elevates character traits that are values-centered above those that are described as toxic and centered on violence and men's most basic instincts, there is little in the form of direction from feminism and allies on the left, rather than describing what a man should not be and the traits that are most abhorrent. And to the extent that manhood and masculinity is defined by the left, there is a lacking in how to arrive there beyond dismantling patriarchy, which, though important, serves little purpose in the life of a young man growing up trying to find himself and his place in a changing world. I'm not saying that feminists should do the job of shaping men. That would be abdicating on our responsibility as men. I'm merely pointing out that there is an environment where what is most toxic about masculinity is regularly at the fore, and rightfully so. But we miss out on describing to young men who are in their formative years exactly what a man should be, particularly in a modern and progressive society. Professor Kopano Ratele's book, Why Men Hurt Women and Other Reflections, would have provided valuable direction at this point, because in it he explores how we can reimagine a more loving masculinity while also reflecting on what it is about men that causes them to behave in violent ways even towards people they claim to love. The book, however, only comes out in September and was unavailable to us at the time of recording. So I fished my net wide and caught on to our next figure, whose book is of great value in our endeavor to shape the kind of responsible and accountable masculinity that is centered on values, integrity, and kindness. Jordan Peterson is an outspoken and politically controversial figure and public intellectual. He first rose to public prominence after he opposed an amendment to the Canadian Rights Act in the Criminal Code, passed by the Parliament of Canada, to introduce gender identity and expression as a prohibited grounds for discrimination. He opposed it on free speech grounds because it would demand that people legally be referred to by their chosen pronouns, either he, she, or them, under threat of legal sanction.
So I went and read all the policies. Well, one of the policies was that if you didn't use the preferred pronouns of a given group, that you could be charged essentially with a hate crime. And I thought, No,
Which
that's
given
no.
group is that? You're talking about transgender people.
Yeah, and so there's all these pronouns that have come up. There's 70 different sets of pronouns approximately to hypothetically describe people who don't fit anywhere on the gender spectrum, which is also something that I don't really understand. I don't understand that conceptually.
We're not here to discuss the complex social discussions around gender identity, perhaps in another episode. What is important is that when discussing issues of social importance, such as defining a masculinity that is values-centered, there is a propensity amongst progressive groups to be dismissive of voices that don't align to left-leaning and progressive politics. This is flawed and is the equivalent of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It dismisses voices which can contribute to issues solely based on their political conservatism, and is why progressives are often viewed as high and mighty. His book, 12 Rules for Life, has more to do with his clinical work and not with his politics. And in our endeavor to define a masculinity for young men away from what is toxic and violent, it is a worthwhile read. In the book 12 Rules for Life, Jordan Peterson provides a map towards shaping qualities around masculinity that I view as antithetical to toxic masculinity, while at the same time are practical, that any young man reading the book would be guided towards living a standard of integrity that shuns the most violent aspects of men who are perpetrators in instances of gender-based violence. He provides simple rules as would a wise father to their son, such as pursue what is meaningful and not what is expedient, which is simply a rule about following a vision for your life away from the short-sighted distractions. A second one would be set your house in order before you criticize the world, which isn't a new lesson, but is worth exploring, particularly in a world where young men are distracted by what is outside rather than what is values-centered and approach towards figuring out who they are before they attempt to influence the world. These are just two rules in his book. They aren't a cure to toxic masculinity, but what they are is a way of molding young minds and directing them towards what is a masculinity that is centered on integrity. Ultimately, there is nothing a government official or even President Cyril Ramaphosa can say that would convince a potentially abusive individual from acting on their violence. But there is something you and I can do within the spaces and social circles we occupy to make it shameful enough for that person so that they understand that there are social consequences to violence against women and children in particular. There are no social consequences for being an abuser or even rapist, as pointed out by Pumla, Dineo, Gqola in her book. In the rare instances when men are in fact prosecuted for violence against women, it is usually enough for perpetrators of violence against women that they have been convicted and have served their time, as though that is some kind of absolution. And as Pumla Gqola points out, prior imprisonment or conviction does not always curtail perpetrators from repeating an offense. Our entitlement as men to women's bodies, as it is often expressed even when we speak about protecting them, in statements such as, we need to protect our women. We need to do better for our women. And this is problematic because women aren't ours and have agency outside of our desires and objectification of them. These seem like trivial points, but speak to how even amongst men with good intention, there remain antiquated ideas about women and their agency. The lack of social consequences for violence against women is so evident that men who have been accused of rape can even become president of a country, while their victims carry the public shame and scorn from society. And that is simply not good enough if we are honest in our desire to curb the worst tendencies amongst each other as men to ensure that we build a society where even we don't fear for our daughters' and wives' lives. This is an obviously complex discussion and is deeply layered, particularly because it touches all our lives in some way. But we must always cast our minds to why it's important that we grapple with this, no matter how difficult. And that reason is that women continue to lose their lives at alarming rates in South Africa. Mothers, daughters, wives. And we need to remember their faces and picture who they are when considering the consequences of what seem like inconsequential remarks when we're out drinking with our friends or in banter at sports events.